Zohran Mamdani's story didn't begin in the marble halls of power or the glass towers of Manhattan. It began thousands of miles away, in the vibrant streets of Kampala, Uganda. Born in 1991 to a family of intellectuals and activists, he inherited a legacy of courage and conviction before he ever set foot in America. His father, Mahmoud Mamdani, was a renowned scholar of African politics. His mother, Mira Nair, was an acclaimed film director known for bringing raw human stories to the global screen. Together, they gave Zohran a childhood defined by curiosity, creativity, and consciousness, a rare combination that would later shape the way he saw New York City, not as a playground for the powerful, but as a battleground for the overlooked. When he was 7, the family relocated to New York. For young Zohran, the transition from Uganda's warmth to New York's concrete energy was dizzying. He remembers riding the subway for the first time, how the blur of faces and languages fascinated him. That chaotic diversity would later become his political compass. The understanding that New York's greatest strength lay in its people, not its profits. He grew up in a modest apartment in Manhattan, attended public schools, and, unlike the polished elite who often dominate city politics, he never lost touch with the daily grind that defined working-class life. At the Bronx High School of Science, Zohran was not the loudest voice in the room, but he was the most curious. Teachers noted how he questioned everything, from the fairness of school policies to the deeper purpose of history lessons. His classmates recall him as the one who stayed late to debate ethics and equity, often defending the unpopular position. He had that spark, one teacher later said, not the kind that wants to win an argument, but the kind that wants to understand how the world breaks people and how to fix it. After graduating, Zohran attended Bowdoin College in Maine, majoring in economics and philosophy. It was there that his political awareness solidified into a mission. While his peers were interning on Wall Street or preparing for law school, Zohran spent his summers volunteering with housing justice groups, tutoring immigrant students, and studying how public policy shaped poverty. He wasn't drawn to politics because of power. It was because of proximity to suffering, to inequity, and to voices that went unheard. When he returned to New York after college, the city was changing fast. Luxury developments were rising where community centers once stood. Rent hikes were displacing working families in Queens and the Bronx. Homeless shelters overflowed. The very soul of the city, the grit, the struggle, the shared humanity, was being priced out. It was in this environment that Zohran found his calling, not as a politician yet, but as a housing counselor in Queens. Day after day, he met families on the brink, people who had worked decades only to find eviction notices taped to their doors. He didn't just fill out paperwork. He sat with them, listened to them, fought for them. Those encounters transformed him. He began to see housing not as an economic issue, but as a moral one, the foundation of human dignity. That moral clarity would become the hallmark of his later campaigns. But in those early years, he wasn't thinking about elections. He was thinking about how to make a system that punished poverty accountable to the people it failed. As he built connections in the community, he became involved with grassroots organizations pushing for tenant rights and economic justice. He attended rallies, knocked on doors, and joined meetings where frustration hung in the air like humidity. It was during one of those late-night organizing sessions that someone told him half-jokingly, "If you want to change the law, you'll have to make the laws." The idea stuck. In 2020, he made a bold decision to run for the New York State Assembly. Few took him seriously. He was young, brown, Muslim, a democratic socialist in a district that had long been dominated by establishment Democrats. His campaign budget was small, his staff was mostly volunteers, and his office was a borrowed space above a grocery store in Astoria. But he had something money couldn't buy: trust. The people who had seen him fight for them in housing court, who had seen him walk their streets and share their stories, became his first army. His campaign slogan was simple: Queens for the many, not the money. It was less a catchphrase than a declaration of war against political complacency. He spoke directly to working-class voters, not in sound bites, but in the language of everyday struggle. while his opponent distributed glossy mailers and smiled. From podiums, Zohran went door to door speaking to tenants, delivery workers, single mothers and seniors. He talked about rent, bus fares, healthcare, not abstractions but lived realities. The press called him an idealist. His supporters called him a realist with a heart. And when the votes were counted, the realist won. His victory shocked the local establishment. It wasn't supposed to happen. A young socialist had unseated a long-time incumbent, signaling a new wave in New York politics. It was the first sign that the city's undercurrents were shifting, that the forgotten boroughs were finding their voice. In the assembly, Mamdani quickly proved he wasn't there to play nice. He introduced bills that challenged real estate lobbyists and corporate landlords. He demanded rent freezes, expanded tenant protections, and more funding for public housing. Each proposal made headlines, not because of its radical nature, but because of his relentless conviction. He wasn't afraid to call out corruption, even within his own party. Politics, he once said during a floor speech, isn't about who you sit with, it's about who you stand for. But the rise of Zohran Mamdani wasn't just about policy, it was about persona. The media began to take notice of his magnetic blend of intellect and authenticity. Unlike the carefully rehearsed politicians who dominated City Hall, Mamdani spoke like someone still tethered to the streets. He quoted poets in speeches, wore sneakers to rallies, and posted unfiltered videos from subway platforms. Young voters saw in him something they rarely saw in politics: sincerity. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he had all the empathy. As his profile grew, so did his critics. Conservative tabloids labeled him the socialist Prince of Queens. Real estate magnates called him a danger to New York's economy. But every attack only fueled his momentum. He began drawing crowds that looked less like political rallies and more like cultural events: artists, students, activists, and blue-collar workers standing shoulder to shoulder, chanting his name. In those moments, Mamdani wasn't just a politician, he was a movement. Then came the turning point. In late 2023, after years of watching city policies favor developers over dwellers, Mamdani began hinting at something bigger. The whispers started, he's running for mayor. Few believed it possible. New York's political machine was unforgiving, and mayoral races were billion-dollar bloodbaths. But for Mamdani, it wasn't about possibility, it was about necessity. If no one else will fight for us, he told his supporters one night, then I will. By early 2024, the rumors were confirmed. He announced his candidacy on the steps of Queensborough Hall, not with celebrity endorsements or corporate sponsors, but surrounded by tenants, transit workers, and community organizers. The crowd erupted as he declared, "We're going to make this city livable again for everyone, not just the wealthy few." His words went viral, shared across social media as a rallying cry for change. Critics scoffed. They said he was too inexperienced, too radical, too idealistic. But Mamdani knew the pulse of the city better than they did. He wasn't trying to charm the boardrooms. He was speaking to the bodegas, the barbershops, the bus stops. He wasn't just asking for votes, he was demanding a moral reckoning. And slowly the impossible began to look inevitable. In a political landscape where image often overshadows integrity, Mamdani managed to be both authentic and iconic. His speeches blended passion with poetry. His rallies felt like concerts of conviction. He understood the power of narrative, not as a means of manipulation, but as a means of mobilization. He told stories of evicted families who found new homes, of immigrants who found hope, of neighborhoods that refused to be erased. "When we fight for housing," he said in one speech that went viral, "we fight for the soul of New York." By the time his campaign posters began appearing across the city, painted in bold colors, showing him smiling beneath the skyline, Zohran Mamdani was no longer just a name on a ballot. He was a symbol of resistance, of renewal, of what politics could look like if empathy, not ego, took the lead. But even as his star rose, he never forgot where it all began. He still rode the subway. He still visited tenants facing eviction. He still attended community meetings long after the cameras left. "I am here," he would often say, because you believed in a dream bigger than fear. The night before his mayoral campaign officially launches, in his small apartment he sits by the window, watching the city lights flicker like stars scattered across the skyline. Somewhere in the distance a siren wails, a reminder that the city never sleeps, and neither can those who wish to change it. He takes a deep breath, knowing that tomorrow he will face an army of skeptics and cynics. But for now he allows himself a smile. From Kampala to Queens, from underdog to outsider, Zohran Mamdani has already defied the odds. What comes next will test not just his politics, but his purpose. And as the night hums with the restless energy of New York, one thing is certain: his story is only beginning. When Zohran Mamdani announced his candidacy for mayor in October 2024, the political world barely looked up from its coffee. The headlines were small, tucked beneath stories about crime rates, Wall Street forecasts, and celebrity divorces. To most analysts, his campaign was a novelty act, a young socialist assembly member from Queens up against the towering figure of Andrew Cuomo, a man whose name had dominated New York politics for decades. He'll make some noise, one pundit chuckled on cable news, but he's not going anywhere. What none of them understood was that Zohran Mamdani wasn't trying to make noise. He was building an earthquake. His campaign began not in Midtown or City Hall, but in a crowded community center in Jackson Heights. The air smelled of coffee and ambition, the room filled with volunteers from every background imaginable: teachers, students, cab drivers, nurses, and delivery workers. Most of them had never been part of a political campaign before. Mamdani stood before them, sleeves rolled up, his voice steady but charged. "This city is not broken," he said. "It's been stolen, and we're here to take it back." The line electrified the room. Phones came out, clips were uploaded, and within hours his speech had gone viral on TikTok and X. It wasn't slick or rehearsed. It was raw, real, and righteous. The heart of his message was simple. New York's working people deserved more than survival. He promised a rent freeze for 5 years, free public buses and subways, universal childcare, and higher taxes on the ultra-wealthy. Critics called it utopian. His supporters called it salvation. To a city exhausted by inequality, his words felt like oxygen. He didn't speak the language of policy papers. He spoke the language of pain, hope, and possibility. Mamdani's team was small but surgical. They operated from a converted laundromat in Astoria that doubled as a campaign headquarters. The walls were plastered with maps of precincts, handwritten notes, and photographs of supporters. Every morning, volunteers gathered there for dispatch, a daily ritual where Mamdani would brief them personally before they hit the streets. "We don't sell promises," he told them. "We sell belief." He understood something fundamental. Politics in 2025 wasn't won on TV anymore. It was won on phones, on doorsteps, and in the digital trenches. His social media campaign was unlike anything New York had ever seen. Instead of high-budget commercials, his team produced short cinematic clips that showed him walking through subway stations, visiting food pantries, or playing basketball with local kids. The videos weren't just political, they were emotional. They made him relatable, human, even heroic. In one clip that racked up 4 million views, he was shown fixing a leaky sink in a public housing apartment while saying, "Leadership means getting your hands dirty." The comment section exploded. "This is the mayor we need." Behind the charisma was a strategy. Mamdani's campaign leaned heavily on multilingual outreach. His team printed flyers in Spanish, Bengali, Mandarin, Urdu, and Haitian Creole. He held town halls where interpreters stood beside him, ensuring no voice was left out. In neighborhoods long ignored by the establishment, people felt seen. He visited mosques during Ramadan, churches during Sunday services, and temples during Diwali. Every visit was authentic, not performative. He didn't speak to crowds like a politician. He spoke like a neighbor. Meanwhile, his opponents underestimated him. Andrew Cuomo's campaign was textbook establishment. Glossy ads, big donors, and endless endorsements. But it felt cold, mechanical. Cuomo tried to frame himself as the adult in the room, but in a city weary of old power, his tone came off as paternalistic. His slogan, "Experience you can trust," felt tired next to Mamdani's rallying cry, "The city we deserve." As winter turned to spring, the polls began to shift. Slowly at first, then dramatically. By March 2025, Mamdani had climbed from 9% to 36% in the Democratic primary, shocking political strategists. Reporters scrambled to explain the phenomenon. Some said it was the TikTok generation, others said it was a reaction to corporate greed. But those who attended his rallies knew the truth. It was about belonging. His rallies weren't ordinary political gatherings. They felt like cultural festivals. There were poets, musicians, and street vendors. Children waved hand-painted signs. Local artists painted murals of him, surrounded by subway cars and skyline silhouettes. At one rally in the Bronx, 15,000 people filled a park chanting, "Mamdani for the many." When he finally appeared on stage, the crowd roared. "This city taught me everything," he said. "Now it's time to give something back." Yet the closer he got to the front of the race, the more vicious the backlash became. The real estate industry poured millions into attack ads, labeling him dangerous for business. Headlines screamed about his radical socialism and anti-Israel rhetoric. Anonymous, PACs funded whisper campaigns suggesting he was too divisive or too foreign. But Mamdani turned every attack into ammunition. "They're afraid," he told his supporters, "because they've never faced a movement they can't buy." In April, a scandal broke. An email leak revealed that a group of real estate donors had been coordinating behind closed doors to fund anti-Mamdani efforts across the city. The revelation lit the campaign on fire. Instead of dodging the controversy, Mamdani leaned in. He held a press conference in front of a luxury development site and said, "If standing with tenants makes me radical, then call me the most radical man in New York." The clip aired on every major network. His authenticity, his defiance, it made him unstoppable. The primary debates became must-watch television. Cuomo towered behind the podium, projecting calm authority. Mamdani stood beside him, sleeves rolled, speaking with fiery precision. When Cuomo accused him of peddling pipe dreams, Mamdani shot back, "Pipe dreams are what working families live in when you let landlords run the city." The audience erupted in applause. That exchange alone was replayed millions of times across social media, effectively sealing the narrative, the old guard versus the new hope. By the time the Democratic primary arrived in June, New York was divided, but not in the usual ways. It wasn't rich versus poor, or borough versus borough. It was establishment versus insurgency. Mamdani's team mobilized an army of 25,000 volunteers, canvassing subways, markets, and apartment buildings. The night of the primary, his headquarters buzzed with tension. The early results favored Cuomo, but as mail-in ballots and ranked choice preferences were tallied, the tide shifted. At 2:14 a.m., the final count came in. Zohran Mamdani had won the Democratic nomination. The victory sent shockwaves through the city. Pundits called it a political earthquake. Cuomo refused to concede at first, muttering about algorithmic misinformation and digital populism, but none of it mattered. The photos told the story. Mamdani standing on a stage in Queens drenched in confetti, hugging his volunteers as chants of "Yes, we rent" echoed into the night. The general election was a different battlefield. The Republicans rallied behind Curtis Sliwa, while Cuomo re-entered the race as an independent. That three-way split could have fractured Mamdani's base, but his campaign evolved. He doubled down on people-powered politics. His rallies grew larger, his tone more presidential. He stopped talking about if he'd win and started talking about when. He walked through the streets of Harlem with pastors, through Chinatown with small business owners, through Staten Island with transit workers. Every appearance felt historic. By late summer, he had become a cultural icon. Magazines featured him on covers under headlines like "The People's Mayor" and "The New Face of New York." Fashion blogs gushed over his minimalist wardrobe, rolled shirts, clean sneakers, and a campaign pin shaped like the subway M. Late-night hosts imitated his speeches. TikTok creators remixed his lines into beats. He wasn't just a politician anymore, he was a phenomenon. But fame came with friction. As the campaign intensified, security had to be increased after he received multiple threats related to his Gaza ceasefire stance. Critics accused him of weaponizing compassion, while supporters praised his bravery. Through it all, Mamdani stayed grounded. "They can attack my words," he said, "but they'll never erase the truth." His campaign strategy in the final stretch was brilliant. emotional storytelling combined with data-driven precision. His digital team mapped out neighborhoods by issue rather than demographics. Buses in Brooklyn, rent in Queens, healthcare in the Bronx. Every message was personal. When he spoke about public transit, he mentioned his daily commute. When he spoke about housing, he named real families. It wasn't politics anymore, it was testimony. Election night, November 4, 2025, began like a movie. The city buzzed with anticipation. Pundits predicted a close race. Polls were within 3 points. At 9 p.m., exit polls showed a dead heat. At 10 p.m., Mamdani pulled ahead in Queens. At 11, he surged in Brooklyn. And by midnight, the networks called it Zohran Mamdani had won the mayoralty of New York City. The celebration outside his campaign headquarters looked like a block party. Music blared, strangers hugged, and fireworks crackled over the skyline. On stage, Mamdani took the microphone, voice hoarse, eyes gleaming. "This is not my victory," he shouted. "It's yours. It's every renter who feared eviction, every worker who kept this city alive, every dreamer who was told they didn't belong. Tonight, New York belongs to you again." As confetti rained down and cameras flashed, Zohran Mamdani stood on that stage as something more than a politician. He was proof that authenticity could still triumph over cynicism, that hope could still outvote money, and that even in the heart of America's most capitalist city, the voice of the people could still echo louder than the clink of champagne glasses in penthouses above. The campaign that began in a small Queens community center had ended in City Hall's victory balcony. But for Mamdani, it was never just about winning. It was about showing that the city's beating heart, the immigrant, the dreamer, the worker, still had power. And as the lights of Manhattan glimmered across the East River, he smiled, whispering to a volunteer beside him, "They said we couldn't do it. But look, we did." And in that moment, the impossible became history. The confetti had barely settled on the steps of City Hall when the weight of history began to press against Zohran Mamdani's shoulders. The man who had started his journey as a housing counselor in Queens was now the mayor-elect of New York City, the first Muslim, the first South Asian, and one of the youngest leaders ever to hold that title. It was a night of euphoria, of disbelief turned into destiny. Yet even as the cameras flashed and the chants of Mayor Mamdani echoed through the streets, he knew that victory was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an even greater battle, turning promises into power in a city that had always tested its dreamers. The morning after the election, New York woke to a new political reality. The tabloids screamed, "The socialist mayor," in bold red letters, while progressive outlets hailed a new dawn for New York. Outside City Hall, hundreds gathered to celebrate, waving homemade signs that read, "Housing is a human right, and transit for the people." To them, Mamdani's victory was a revolution in a suit, a rejection of politics as usual, a victory for renters over landlords, and proof that empathy could beat money. But across the East River, the mood was different. In Manhattan boardrooms and political clubs, whispers of panic circulated. Investors fretted about stock fluctuations. Lobbyists strategized countermeasures. The city's power brokers had just watched an outsider seize the fortress, and they weren't about to surrender it quietly. Mamdani's transition team set up operations in a modest building in Astoria, symbolic of his grassroots ethos. Unlike past mayors who celebrated victory with champagne galas, Mamdani spent his first week visiting boroughs that had carried him to victory. In the Bronx, he met tenants facing eviction. In Brooklyn, he spoke with transit workers on overnight shifts. In Queens, he returned to the same housing court where he once helped families keep their homes. Each visit was filmed not by professional crews, but by volunteers, then shared across social media with the simple caption, "The work starts now." But governing was different from campaigning. The media honeymoon was brief. Within days, the same networks that once marveled at his charisma began to question his competence. Could a socialist truly manage America's largest capitalist city? Was his rent freeze policy realistic? Could he balance compassion with fiscal responsibility? The headlines grew harsher. Mamdani's promises meet city budget reality. Wall Street warns of exodus. Can utopian politics survive New York? Behind closed doors, even some allies worried. His ambitious policies, Expanding rent control, making transit free, taxing luxury real estate required billions in funding. The city's budget analysts warned of shortfalls. Developers threatened to halt projects. Business leaders hinted they might relocate. But Mamdani didn't flinch. "We've been told for decades that we can't afford to care," he said at a press conference. "The truth is we can't afford not to." His defiance made headlines again, but it also deepened divisions between City Hall and corporate New York. Then came the international controversy. Only a week after his victory, Mamdani reiterated his call for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, echoing the same stance that had defined his campaign months earlier. His words, "Peace is not radical. War is," and set off a firestorm. Pro-Israel groups accused him of bias. Progressive activists applauded his courage. The debate consumed news cycles for days. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, some carrying flags, others carrying placards with his face on them, half haloed, half demonized. The mayor-elect handled the storm with characteristic calm. "If leadership means silence in the face of injustice," he said in an interview, "then I was never meant to lead." But even his closest advisors saw the toll it took. Death threats began arriving in his inbox. Hate mail flooded his office. Security was quietly increased around his home. The man who had promised to be the people's mayor suddenly found himself shielded by tinted cars and armed guards, a contradiction that weighed heavily on him. Despite the chaos, Mamdani refused to retreat from the public eye. He continued walking to work, chatting with bus drivers and street vendors, taking selfies with supporters. "They need to see I'm still one of them," he told his communications team. And in those brief sidewalk conversations, something remarkable persisted: belief. The people still believed in him. Even as critics sharpened their knives, his approval ratings among working-class voters remained strong. Inside his transition office, plans for the first 100 days were taking shape. His top priorities: establishing a citywide rent relief authority, initiating a pilot program for free MTA rides, and proposing a billionaire fair share tax. Each of these initiatives sent ripples through the political landscape. Business groups called his proposals reckless. Real estate magnates called them class warfare. But among New Yorkers squeezed by rent, student loans, and inflation, his plans felt like long overdue justice. Then came the first major test. In early December, leaked documents suggested that the Real Estate Board of New York, ReBNY, was preparing to file a lawsuit to block his rent freeze order, arguing it violated state property laws. The leak set off another political earthquake. Mamdani's response was swift and surgical. He held a fiery press conference on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by tenants and union leaders. "They say freezing rent is unconstitutional," he thundered. "I say pricing human beings out of their homes is immoral." The clip went viral within hours, drawing millions of views and reigniting his image as the people's fighter. Still, behind his bold public posture, the pressure was immense. Advisors debated how far to push before alienating moderate Democrats on the city council. Some urged compromise, others urged confrontation. Mamdani listened, quietly scribbling notes during late-night meetings, before finally saying, "We didn't come this far to become what we fought." That line would later appear in his memoir. Meanwhile, his personal life became tabloid material. Paparazzi followed him, leaving his modest apartment, speculating about his family and relationships. Photos of him grabbing coffee in Jackson Heights appeared with headlines like, "New York's most unlikely celebrity mayor." Lifestyle magazines featured him in profiles, focusing on his minimalist wardrobe and his refusal to move into Gracie Mansion. He became both a political icon and a pop culture curiosity, half leader, half legend. But fame is fickle, and controversy sells faster than hope. In late December, conservative media outlets began running exposés questioning his ties to activist organizations. A viral video edited out of context showed him saying, "Capitalism is failing New York." Opponents used it to claim he wanted to dismantle the city's economy. Overnight, hashtags like Mayor Marks trended on social media. His communication team scrambled to respond, releasing the full video, where his words were clearly about housing inequality, but the damage lingered. Even then, he refused to play defense. "They can mock my ideas," he said during a CNN interview, "but they can't erase the truth that millions of New Yorkers are one rent increase away from losing their homes." That candor won back much of the public. People admired that he didn't dodge questions or hide behind consultants. In an era of scripted leaders, Mamdani's unfiltered honesty was his armor. As January approached, City Hall prepared for Inauguration Day. For many, it symbolized the arrival of a new generation of leadership. Invitations went out not to celebrities or billionaires, but to teachers, cab drivers, street cleaners, and nurses. The event was held outdoors in Brooklyn's Prospect Park, a deliberate choice to make it accessible to the public. When the day arrived, the park overflowed with tens of thousands of New Yorkers from every borough. Children perched on shoulders, street musicians played drums, and chants of "the People's Mayor" echoed between the trees. As Zohran Mamdani stepped onto the stage, the winter sunlight reflected off the microphones. His mother, filmmaker Mira Nair, watched from the front row, tears glistening in her eyes. His father, the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani, stood quietly beside her, proud but solemn. The oath was brief, the applause thunderous. And then the new mayor took the microphone. "My friends," he began, his voice steady, "they said this city could never change. They said power would never shift hands. But look around you. It already has. This is what democracy looks like, when the landlord, the janitor, the teacher, and the nurse all stand side by side and say, 'Enough.'" The crowd erupted. "Today we begin not as rulers but as neighbors," he continued. "We begin not with promises but with purpose. And we will make this city not just livable, but lovable again." The speech would be replayed on every major network that night. Some commentators dismissed it as idealism. Others called it the most inspiring address since Obama's 2008 victory. But for the thousands in that park, it was more than words. It was a new beginning. In the days that followed, Mamdani's administration hit the ground running. His first executive order froze all evictions pending review. His second established the Office of Housing Justice. His third mandated transparency in city contracts, a direct shot at decades of backroom deals. Each move earned both applause and outrage. The Wall Street Journal called him a populist with a pen. The Daily News hailed him as the conscience of the city. But beyond the politics and spectacle, Mamdani's real challenge loomed. Could he keep the fire alive? Could he transform a movement into management, idealism into implementation? New York had seen many mayors rise on waves of hope, only to drown in bureaucracy and backlash. Yet Mamdani's resilience, his refusal to retreat, hinted that this story might end differently. Late one night, weeks after his inauguration, he stood on the roof of City Hall, looking out over the skyline. The skyscrapers gleamed, the streets pulsed with life, and somewhere in the distance the faint wail of a siren reminded him why he'd started this journey. His chief of staff joined him, asking quietly, "Was it worth it?" Mamdani smiled faintly. "Hey, it's only worth it if we don't waste it." He turned back toward the city that had doubted him, defied him, and ultimately embraced him, and whispered, "Let's get to work." And just like that, the revolution of belief became the labor of governance. The underdog had become the mayor. The outsider had become the system's most dangerous insider. And New York, in all its chaos and beauty, would never be the same again.